Hello everyone, my name is Georgiana Skivias and today I will be presenting the methods for developing a building exposure database for Nepal. We will go step by step through a series of flowcharts that assist in organizing and determining the type of data that is required for a Level 3 building exposure. A Level 3 building exposure improves upon country-level data by identifying subnational variations in construction patterns based on climate or cultural region-specific norms. As well, a Level 3 building exposure identifies major urban areas and enhances building count or structural mapping schemes. To develop the building exposure, the METEOR team utilized various sources of Earth observation imagery, national statistics, reports, and journals. Additional source references are found in the individual flowchart sections. The building exposure flowcharts are broken down into these 6 flowcharts. Each flowchart asks a series of questions that identifies the data and process required for determining the building height, structural distribution, number of buildings, disametric mapping steps, replacement cost, and building area. Using population and housing census data is the most common method for inferring number of buildings. However, because of the High-Resolution Village Development Committee or VDC data provided by the National Society for Earthquake Technology, NSET, population was not required. Another factor that played a key role in determining the structural distribution was the building height. This information allowed us to make a direct correlation between the number of stories and structural types, as well as perform general heuristic check for outlier data. There were 2 sources for the building height values: the Integrated Public Use Microdata Series, IPUMS, and the field survey data collected by the Kathmandu Living Labs for the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, HOTOSM. In areas designated as rural development, the height distribution was acquired from IPUMS. Specifically, heights for unreinforced brick masonry, UFB1 and UFB5. Based on discussions with Sarad Wago, a Nepali structural engineer, cement mortar was assumed for those unreinforced masonry structures 5 stories or greater. The increased durability and bonding strength in comparison to mud mortar required for multi-story buildings was the logic behind such decision. For low-rise, rural regions, mud mortar was assumed as the bonding agent. For the remaining non-rural development pattern areas, the HOTOSM building survey was used to establish the relationship between the structural type and the story height by development pattern. The data collected by the Kathmandu Living Labs field team was used to characterize the height distribution in urban areas. In rural areas, the distribution of buildings by Administrative Unit Level 2 was used to characterize the building stock, as gleaned from the IPUMS data. Building height vary throughout the country and are typically dependent on the terrain and urbanity of the region. From our data collection exercise, we observed that most structures are primarily low-rise. Here we observe the gradual shift of predominant structural types throughout the region, which is most likely driven by the overabundance of or lack of construction materials and typical construction practices. Unreinforced masonry is predominant in most of the country, with the exception of wood frame structures on the southern border and infilled reinforced concrete structures near the urban core. The distribution of buildings by structure type typically receives the most concerted attention in a risk study, and this project was no exception. The sources used to develop the exposure include in-field surveys, microcensus data, and expert opinion. Due to the active involvement from NSET and high-quality census data, the structural distribution data was quite accurate for Nepal. Steps for estimating the structural distribution or mapping scheme was twofold. First, the structural engineer conducts a web reconnaissance of any available data regarding both the construction materials and methodologies within the region, as well as searching for any data that could infer the structural distribution within the country. Sources such as the World Housing Encyclopedia, Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response, BAGER, and the Global Earthquake Model, GEM, were reviewed to identify all known structural types within the country. These preliminary types were validated through the Nepal National Building Code and Google Street View survey. After the web recon, using the 2011 Nepal VDC level census data, the rural development pattern was assigned a mapping scheme using the building wall material type and number of household value. The building height values for UFB1 and UFB5 within the rural development pattern zones were obtained from the IPUMS dataset. Kathmandu Living Labs conducted a building survey for HUD-OSM and implemented a stratified sampling strategy and used a Bayesian updating approach. The collected survey data provided the structural mapping scheme for each development pattern. The HUD-OSM building survey data was reviewed and verified by a local in-country engineer from INSET and in-house engineer from ImageCat. All of the mapping schemes were mapped to the PAGER standard structural types and then to the GEM taxonomy. These structural types were overlaid with the manually delineated development pattern sample polygons to create a refined mapping scheme. The distribution of structural classes closely reflected known patterns of construction practices with respect to elevation, proximity to India, and urbanity. The final round of sanity checks was conducted by ImageCat. Development patterns are patterns of construction in a given country that typify the building structure development and density as much as possible. They sometimes correspond to land use, but not always. The development patterns are determined by a structural engineer working with a GIS analyst to conduct a web reconnaissance exercise using Google Earth and structural distribution web searches to characterize the urbanity density and development pattern for each country. For Nepal, the ImageCat engineer characterized 8 development pattern types. Here we see the final results of the mapping schemes as percentages of households by structural class mapped to the administrative VDC units in Nepal. Typically, the number of buildings is estimated from populations and average number of persons per household. As previously mentioned in the case of Nepal, NSET was able to provide the estimated number of households by Village Development Committee, VDC, which is approximately 700 administrative zones. However, Kathmandu was covered by a single zone, and exposure still needed to be converted into number of buildings. The total number of buildings was inferred using a combination of datasets, which include IPUMS, VDC census data, OpenStreetMap survey data, and aggregated OSM building count raster. These were used to estimate the average number of households per building type for each VDC census unit. Using the Nepal census number of households per VDC by wall material type, A relationship between the average total building area using structural type was created to calculate total number of buildings for a rural zone. For each development pattern, a project analyst reviewed 15 arcsecond grid cells, selected using a random number generator, and identified cells where at least 90% of the buildings were represented in the OpenStreetMap building footprint database. These selected grids were used to train a regression model using 3 arcsecond Earth observation data, which includes the Sentinel-1 SAR mosaic with dual polarization bands, Facebook Connectivity Labs and CSEN's high-resolution settlement layer, and the global urban footprint from DLR. In addition, the model was constrained using OpenStreetMap building footprints with an area of 10 meters square to 5,000 meters square to create an aggregated 3 arcsecond building count raster as a minimum value. We found that Sentinel-1 SAR mosaic proved more effective in highly developed regions, whereas GUF was better suited for rural areas. Disometric mapping is the process of spreading the number of buildings from the VDC census data to the 3 arcsecond grid by way of statistical assessment of moderate resolution Earth observation data. To collect Earth observation indicators of settlement and density of buildings, various remote sensing datasets were used. These include the following remotely sensed data products were used for the disometric mapping. The data was obtained from the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, NOAA, NASA, the U.S. Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the European Commission Joint Research Center, the German Aerospace Center, WorldPop, and OpenStreetMap. These remotely sensed Earth observation products and building footprint aggregates establish the distribution statistics for dispersing buildings by urban density and determining the development pattern types throughout the country. Each of the Earth observation products individually and in combination act as a weight to disperse the known number of households per VDC by structural type and development pattern to the 3 arcsecond grid cells. For example, with development pattern 1 or 2, which resemble the rural or single-family residential communities, the even building distribution of the VDC is reallocated only to grid cells within the VDCs associated to human settlement. When determining the weights for distribution within a given VDC, several machine learning algorithms were run using the Earth observation data to develop a prediction model. In the case of Nepal, which has very complex terrain, GUF was highly weighted, and support vector was determined to be the most effective AI tool. For development patterns with higher populations and building density, the reallocation of buildings became more complex and requires a more detailed examination of the structural types and mapping schemes. To prevent unpopulated areas from being considered as settlements, especially in highly mountainous terrain, a mask was created by combining the extents of nighttime lights, ambient population, and the Landsat-based global human settlement layer. These datasets were reclassified into inhabited versus uninhabited masks using a minimum threshold value determined by visual inspection. These minimal values correspond to even the sparsest of human presence. This mask was used to subset the high-resolution global urban footprint Sentinel-1 based GHSL product, Sentinel-1 SAR mask, and the high-resolution settlement layer that go into the machine learning process for coming up with the development patterns. Subsetting these datasets decreases the processing time. To characterize building density in more populated areas, analysts digitized development pattern training polygons in the top 10 most populated cities in the country. For these cities, the digitized vector data was used directly rather than the classified development pattern grid. The sample vectors were digitized using the Google Earth Area tool and saved as KMLs. The base map vintage and source used during digitization vary by region and zoom level. However, the most current high-resolution satellite images are used. The training polygons and the moderate resolution Earth observation products described above are used in a machine learning process for assessing the development patterns throughout the country, which informs the estimated building density. The intensity of urbanity correlates to both the building density and the structural distribution. For Nepal, the ImageCAD engineer characterized 8 development pattern types. The process of disametric mapping in Nepal was challenging due to the prevalence of mountainous terrain. Both the Sentinel-1 SAR mosaic and the optical Earth observation data often interpreted steep terrain as associated to built environment. To remedy this situation, the project team reviewed the results on a regional basis and made adjustments. Here's an example of the SAR mosaic built-up indicators. In the image to the left, the bright blue strips of higher reflectance can be clearly seen to correlate with the OSM building footprints seen in red in the image to the right. It can also be seen that regardless of the relative pervasive building footprint data, many urban areas are missed and cannot be inferred. In the delta in the southern half of the image, the SAR mosaic is highly effective. As we move further north into the hilly terrain, detecting built-up environments become more difficult. But in the high terrain areas in the northeast of the image, the sensor is no longer effective. The replacement cost values were provided by the National Society of Earthquake Technology, NSET. The replacement cost values were derived by an in-country survey conducted by the Kathmandu Living Labs and Hot OSM in the surrounding urban and rural areas of Kathmandu. Here are the replacement cost values for Nepal in US dollars. Here we have the estimated replacement cost values for Kathmandu and the surrounding region. For the building area, data was collected from multiple sources and applied in separate geographies to estimate building area. As with the building height, the total building area was calculated using a combination of IPUMS, Nepal census data, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team survey data, and a 3 arcsecond aggregated OSM building area raster created by ImageCAD. For the rural development pattern type, the height distribution from IPUMS, specifically heights for unreinforced brick masonry, was used along with the average building footprint area from the aggregated building area raster to determine the average total building area. For all non-rural development patterns designated zones, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team building survey was used to establish the total building area by structural type for development pattern using the survey building footprint and height values. There is a great deal of information that goes into creating a building exposure. The aim of these flowcharts is to 1. Assist future researchers in updating and refining the exposure database as a whole or fine-tuning individual sections with improved data. 2. Assist in organizing the metadata collection. And 3. Work through the logic of the processing steps. That concludes the flowchart demonstration. We hope that these flowcharts assist you and the future teams in conducting, updating, and refining a Level 3 building exposure. Thank you, and have a good day.